Rabbit Trails podcast. Hey, Garrett, how about we do a podcast?
Let's do a podcast.
Man, listen, I hope you are doing well on your side of the world there in Spain.
We are.
We have a wind advisory today. I was going to do this from my balcony, but you would not be able to hear me because it would sound like Judgment Day has blown in.
It's actually quite cold here for early April, and there's been a ton of snow up in the mountains. We live by the mountains. Really? So actually the snow's a lot lower down than normal for this time of year. So it's been snowing up in the mountains for like 2 straight weeks. So there's a ton of snow.
And no one can go up there.
No one can go up there and go skiing.
Gosh, it's just like taunting going on.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Well, hey, listen, man, enjoyed the last podcast. That was a lot of fun. Gotten good feedback so far. So I think all signs point to where we should give the people what they want, a second episode.
A second episode.
And so we will make every effort to do that. My mind has been, since we're calling this the Rabbit Trails podcast, my mind has been going in all sorts of different directions lately, from just the current events that are going on to things I've always wanted to do, dreaming. I was actually supposed to be in Spain this weekend, and that trip got canceled.
Yeah,
so all sorts of stuff that's going on. And but I wonder, where is your mind going lately as you think deeply? I don't know about you, but this whole let's say quarantine type situation. We're not on quarantine in Sweden, but we're not getting out as much as we used to.
Yeah.
It gives a lot of time for reflection. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking. I mean, you and I, we text back and forth with our buddies on Facebook Messenger. But what are you thinking about these days?
Yeah, well, I think something you and I chat about quite a bit, but is the current social cultural milieu. Is that how you say that, milieu?
Yeah.
I'll say it like a Texan, milieu.
Actually, funny thing, my wife and I got into a conversation about that because she said that I pronounced it the Swedish way, which is the Swedish word for it is milieu, which is environment, which also is French, and they're related. But she was like, you sounded more Swedish than French, which is to be understood. It's the first time anyone told me that my accent sounded Swedish.
That's good. That's a good sign. Been there a while. Yeah, I mean, it's thinking about Europe, particularly Western Europe, where we live, and the what certain people would call secularism, or you can kind of throw postmodernism in there, but what we're talking about is a secular society, and what exactly that means. What does that mean for Christianity? What does that mean for people who are following Jesus, and what does it mean for people who are in for lack of a better term, missions? The communication of the Christian message of the gospel, the good news.
How would you? Because it's interesting. We throw around terms all the time, right? Like secular, postmodern, liquid modern, liquid postmodern, postmodern, liquid.
Yes.
Liquid
post-Christian,
secular, post-Christian, all of those things. How would you go about defining what is the best definition, or even your personal working definition of secular?
Yeah, well, I think on a very clear, simple way, one of the guys who does a good job of that is a guy named Stefan Paas. He's a Dutch theologian, thinker. And he would say generally what that means, and I'll quote him here, he'll say low and decreasing levels of church attendance, widespread lack of belief in traditional Christian doctrines, Christian specifically because Europe was the heart of Christianity for not decades, centuries. I was starting to think in Spanish, for centuries, but also a general indifference towards traditional religious questions, a general indifference. And then I would go to, then after that, maybe to a guy named Charles Taylor. So that's Stefan Paas breaks it down pretty soon. I think we can kind of get a grasp of that, right? Indifference to religion or to Christianity. But I think Charles Taylor wrote this book called A Secular Age, which is massive.
Great
He's
book.
A Catholic Canadian philosopher, really literally heavy lifting because it's giant. It's a giant book, but it's also, very mentally. But he would say for a secular society, basically, it is a society or a culture that's basically has accepting no final goals beyond human flourishing. So having successful life, having a successful culture, society, that's the ultimate goal. And nor any allegiance to anything else beyond this flourishing. So what he means there is, he would say in previous generations throughout history, flourishing was tied to a belief in a higher power. You couldn't have one without the other.
Yeah.
So your society, your people are going to flourish because there's a God, you believe in that God, and you're trying to order your life within his order. That's flourishing, and that creates flourishing. But he's going to say now in a secular society that we believe in, we can have a flourishing society. We don't need God. God doesn't need to be a part of that. And he would say this is the first time in human history that understanding, that imaginary, that way the culture sees and understands that without even assuming, there's no one's questioning that. They just assume that's normalized, and so people aren't even questioning that. They're not reflecting on that. They go, well, yeah, of course. Why would we need God in that?
So can I ask you a question on that? In Spain, because it certainly is the case when you describe, you said a few words there, indifference. Gosh, if ever there was a word to describe Swedish feelings towards anything transcendent, it is indifference. Yeah. And that sense of well-being, human flourishing can be achieved on its own. All of that describes Sweden perfectly. I've taken to describing recently Sweden as has a very clinical approach to life. So they don't tend to concern themselves. So, for example, so stylistically, Sweden doesn't have a lot of flourishes. It's very simple, clean lines, minimalist in a lot of ways.
Yeah, IKEA.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, I have a friend. You know her, Nicole Lewis, who we both admire and love. She refers to the Swedish as the Japanese of Europe, and so kind of minimalist. Although the Japanese have a different relationship with religion in some ways than the Swedes do, but all that to say, it very much reflects that minimalist, clinical kind of approach of if it helps me, I'm into it. If it doesn't help me, I'm not into it. And since science has said there is no God, therefore I'm not into that. Yeah, is I would say describes. But how is it in Spain? Because you still have widespread. Most people would still describe themselves as Catholic. Yeah, but there's a tension there because they're obviously fairly secular. Or is Spain secular?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think both Poss and Taylor make some allowances for secular societies that still have a patina or a relationship with religion, in this case, Christianity. What you get in Spain is that you get a lot of people saying they're Catholic, and Catholicism and the church isn't a lot of stuff. And it's everywhere, and it's kind of part of culture. But what you get in Spain is a lot of people will go, well, I'm Catholic, but I don't practice. And so they'll make a very strong, clear, and I think you'd say it's pretty similar in Portugal, in Italy, and Greece. So it's part of the culture, it's part of what we do, but really they understand it as just part of the culture. And so there's a clear understanding. So Spain's like 20% practicing Christians who take their faith serious and go to church on some kind of regular basis, or, would say to do something, pray, read the Bible, whatever. But the vast majority of people. So what Poss and I think Taylor would say is like these people are secular in the sense that they still kind of hang around it, but they do not buy into, or they don't submit to the institution or the formal structure of religion. And so there's also probably a little bit of something about. I have a friend here in Granada who's working on. In this area, we might be someone to have on the show one day. Him and his wife, they're working and doing a lot of research and studies on secular Europe. And he's coined a term. I think he's coined a term, but he called folk secularism. Okay. So a little bit of this mixing and matching of, maybe still you believe in God or have some spiritual interests, or you're doing some Eastern stuff as well. But it's all a big mix. It's your personalized, almost, individualized religion. And that's something Taylor talks about too, is really the hallmark. And a lot of people, the hallmark of secularism is hyper-individualism. Hyper-individualism. I am my own person. I create my own reality. Yep. And that's the best thing we can do. And that's...
So it's interesting because early on when we got to Sweden, I started to, the way I would have described most people in life's approach to religion in the secular world that I found myself is, I call it the salad bar approach to religion. So when you go to a salad bar, you don't think, how do I need to best combine all of these elements in order to, have the best salad experience or my best understanding of what is a salad. Rather, you kind of go to it and you go, well, I like these bits, but I don't like these bits. And so I'm going to leave those out. And so that seems to be a lot of what Taylor and Poss would say as well, is that it's that hyper individualization of religion.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, does it work for me? And you see that even in, not to be too critical, but of American evangelicalism, often it's very, right now in our current phase in the world it's very individualistic.
Right.
And what you have in Spain is a country that's very clannish, very family based, very, what's the word? It's very communal.
Yeah. Right.
More so than Northern, European or America. And so what you have now is that individualization is, you could say it's beginning to fracture, not just the religious institutions and religious communities, but it's starting to fracture families, societies,
So what is your average secular Spaniard have to say to all of that as things are fracturing? That it's the fault of the government, that it's fault of the church, that it's the fault of, what do they see as the source of those woes?
Yeah, I think a lot of it would be politics or economic problems. I think you are seeing people who are saying, we have morally, we've given up basic kind of morals, and those are kind of hurting the family. But by and large, people would say, the economy, they would say the politicians, different structures. Most people aren't going to see it as, I don't think most people think about, beyond those levels. What about in Sweden? I mean, or what do you guys see there as far as, is there a fracturing?
Your last, well, yeah, sure. There's fracturing. Actually, my wife and I were talking over lunch today, and she had just read an article in the newspaper, and she wasn't sure of the time frame. She wasn't sure if it was in reference to a coronavirus. She just can't remember exactly the context, but she had read that there were more divorces than marriages in our town in a certain period of time. And, okay, so there's a fracturing there. We, in the same conversation, we're talking about that we need to go to a birthday party or to get a present for a birthday party that my daughter has to go to. And the young girl who she's going over to, her dad just moved into a new house with his now live-in girlfriend, which is standard practice in Swedish. There's actually a Swedish word for it. And her mom now has 2 kids by, her live-in boyfriend, or they live together, her partner rather. And so she's kind of in this situation where, she spends a week here, a week there. For her, it quote unquote seems normal. In Swedish society would say, hey, that's normal. But this girl is 7 years old and this is her life already. But we have friends who are teachers, and what they'll tell you is kids are kind of unraveling in a lot of ways. She teaches junior high and high school. And so she has that perspective. So sure, there's definite fracturing that goes on. What Swedes tend to tell themselves, though, is, well, this is just part of life and you move on. So I mentioned earlier the clinical nature of things. Part of one of the coping mechanisms of Swedish culture is to be a little bit stoic. And just kind of, well, you can't control it. This is how life is. And so you move on. So I will give it to Swedes that when divorces happen, generally speaking, they're actually pretty cordial to each other. But the indifference with which they can treat each other after having had a loving relationship is, to be honest, surprising to me. There's a great Lumineers song, if you know that band.
Yeah.
Stubborn Love. And in that, there's a line that says the opposite of love is indifference. And I love that line because so I see a lot of that. I see a lot of indifference that goes on in Sweden. So yeah, there's fracturing of society, but I would say Swedes. So Charles Taylor talks a lot about the idea of, and this goes back beyond way before Charles Taylor, But it goes back to this idea of enchantment. So the disenchantment of society. And this has been a concern for a long time. And there's a debate there as to whether or not that really is a thing. I mean, society has been disenchanted, but there's a debate as to whether or not that's a new phenomenon. But what I would say is it's widespread now. So in Sweden, the way I describe Sweden is it is the most individualistic, collective thinking society I have ever seen. How everyone arrives at the same conclusion, I can't figure out. There's not variety of conclusions. And so therefore, what people say is, if you ask them, well, do you believe in God? You say, well, I don't believe in silly things, is generally what people's attitude is. Whereas I think a lot of, in the context in which we grew up in America and Texas, and, when you met someone who did not believe in God, it was often maybe what I call the angry atheist, the person who's ready to combat with you. Part of that's a reflection of our American culture that likes to just argue. And there's a place for that. But then part of it is just the fact that there might have been turned off to something or everything else. Here in Sweden, there's just indifference. I don't, in the same way that you and I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the value of the yen relative to hot dogs.
No.
We don't. That's kind of the category that God falls into for Swedes. I don't know why I would think about those things. So
it's very similar in Spain. So even though I still think there's a decent amount of the culture that has a vocabulary, right? So Spain and Christmas, people put up nativity scenes. Christmas is a big deal. So people have the vocabulary,
right?
But if you were actually to get into a conversation, most people, especially students, most, upper class, upper middle class, educated people, it's kind of like, well, that's just not something, now they're not necessarily antagonistic to it. Right. There's a side of the population that is antagonistic. Spain's had a long anti-clerical, anti-church history, that sometimes got pretty violent actually against churches. But what you have is just kind of an indifference, kind of like, well, that's just not, hey, that's good for you. But aside from, maybe going to a few weddings in church and the beauty that churches have, that we see, and there's some good people. Mother Teresa is a great example of something. Jesus is great, but other than that, there's just underlying indifference to all that stuff. It's like, whatever.
Right.
Or ranging to hostility.
They don't see the need. So here's a question. I think it's easy for us as Christians to think, well, we just need to point to those common denominators that you can call them felt needs that people have and how Christ enters into that. So that's then that becomes the quote unquote task of evangelism or sharing Christ with people, making the gospel known. So one of the, first entry points, of course, is, Jesus forgives your sin, hey, aren't you sinful? Hey, there's a solution for that. I don't know about Sweden, or I hope I know about Sweden. I don't know about Spain, but in Sweden, when I say, hey, aren't you miserable as a sinner? I mean, I'm way overstating the way I would present that. The response is, I'm only miserable because you're talking to me. I don't feel miserable. I don't think I have sin.
Yeah, life's good.
Yeah, life's good. Yeah. And so how do you talk to? How does one go about introducing the gospel into that situation? So on the one hand, we have the gospel, which is good news, and it is good news, but we tend to come from a culture that says the good news is that you're saved from your sins, but that's not good news to a person who doesn't believe they have sins.
Yeah, exactly. Or I think in Spain, where you'd have is like, oh, that's the old way people manipulated us, controlling us, and they point out the corruption and abuse of the church, and rightfully so. Those are horrible things. But what you're trying to point people to Jesus, not a structure, not an institution, and that you don't have to deny the institution of it. But so I think that's the big challenge. I think in Spain we have some really kind of advantages. Number one is there is still the vocabulary there, so people, they probably know someone, they've had a good experience here or there. But then what we have is it is a very communal society, and what people are I think against the fracturing, as we're talking about fracturing, people are, looking for community, looking for meaning, they're looking for something. Not everyone, but there are people. And so if you can create what the church is, right? The church is supposed to be a loving community of God's grace. And if you can create that and people can be a part of that, maybe before they even start thinking about Jesus or thinking about God, that's a big step forward, to show that for some people, following Jesus makes a difference in their life in a real way, and how they treat other people and how they welcome people. I think all those things help. Now, I think we're very fortunate that in Spain, it's a country that is social. Now, yeah. I know you've shared that, Sweden is a country that, like this whole social distancing thing for y'all is not a big cultural, it's not a big change. Spaniards are, yeah. This is killing Spaniards. Spaniards need to be with people. They love to be with people. They are party people. They are tactile. So, I have never been kissed and hugged more in, my life since living in Spain. It's just part of who you are. And if you don't reciprocate, people feel there's something in them in this culture, and it's beautiful.
Yeah,
it's right. I really love. But you have other cultures where that's not, So I think you guys have a big challenge there.
Yeah,
have maybe that peg.
Yeah, there's different things that we try to have to hang our hat on. I do think, it's just the activity, I think, that we think of, or not the activity, but the process of making Jesus known and having it enter people's lives. I think it gets drawn out over a longer period of time.
Yeah.
So in some ways, the way I would liken it is back in the 50s in America, what people considered sharing the gospel was going and convincing people that In-N-Out Burger was better than McDonald's. That everyone assumed that hamburgers are a part of life.
Yeah.
Maybe that wouldn't be the best example because neither one of those really existed then. But you get
and they're both horrible.
Yeah. Well, hey, no. In-N-Out Burger. I'm a
Whataburger guy.
You are a Texan. I am too, but I do love the In-N-Out Burger. I embrace it for what it is. I don't pretend that it is anything but a fast food burger. But anyway, needless to say, the point being is you're just trying to convince people from one thing to another. In other words, people had a framework for it. But the way I put it now is it's like I walked into a tea drinking culture and I'm trying to convince people of the virtues of Starbucks.
Yeah.
It's such a why would I do that? And by the way, coffee is, it's bad for the environment and, all these different, I mean, there's reasons for, it's not that they aren't aware of that. It's actually the opposite, that they find it repulsive. Funny story, actually, one of our staff, I was talking to him the other day and he got into a random conversation with a guy and they've been meeting up. But this guy said that everything he knows about Christ, he learned from watching The Simpsons.
There you go.
I was like, wow, that's. I think he may be unique in that, but I
but
think
still,
I mean, that's where it's at. But the interesting thing is I don't think America or lots of places in the world are so far from that anymore.
There's at least large pockets of that. That would be very, totally.
Yeah. So how do you think then that this the milieu that we find ourselves in, this secular, you can't swim in water and not get wet.
Yeah.
How have you found, and this may very well be not the case, you may not feel that it is, but have you seen anywhere areas where you feel like secularism, what I like to call the nice warm blanket of Swedish secularism, because you do look around and you do go, this ain't a bad place to live. Maybe this Jesus thing. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. Some days I go, really maybe I'm the crazy one. Maybe, just confessions of a missionary here, kick me off the field right now. But anyway, so there are those days. Are there areas where you feel like, I worry that I'm being affected by this in X way or whatever else?
Yeah, I think you don't have the community aspect. Whenever we go back to the States and you have a lot of people who talk like you, who are encouraging. They understand who you are, what you do. You have place, right? I mean, this is a whole other thing we can get into at some point or other, but being a cross-cultural Christian worker, you've lost a lot of sense of place in one sense. But then when you're going into a place where it's even harder to find that place, we're very much out there, behind enemy lines, however you want to say it. But that's what we're supposed to be in a lot of ways as followers of Jesus. We're supposed to be in that kind of setting. So I think that's a big one. Community, the access to kind of just good resources. Those things can kind of have a long. I don't think people realize in a lot of other places where they're able to go to church with 500 people and have good teaching, how that can wear away at you over time. That feeling like I'm really out of my place. And, but that would be similar in a lot of places in the world where people are working. But I think because here it's living in Europe, it's fairly easy to live, and I think it's fairly easy to blend in and be a part of what's going on too. These are very open cultures, very welcoming, democratic societies, and it's the great people, great place to live.
Great food.
I think though it does challenge. I think there's some good side of that because it challenged us, I think, to do ministry and communicate the gospel and live as Christians. I don't want to say more authentic. I really don't like that word authentic, but it forces us to really dig down deep and look at things because
totally.
Once again, we talk about strategies and stuff, and what it forces you to be is like, no, this is not about a strategy. This is just about being here, being faithful, and loving people. I think is what that's what I've learned. So it's forced me to try to push that way, and not be about how can I think this through or be awesome or because no one cares if you're let's be a lot of youth ministry in America is based on we just got some guys who are good speakers, good looking, and that kind of stuff here. Well, God is working, and people are encountering Him in very real ways, not in big ways, not in big mass movements, but they are. But it's because I think people are just being faithful and loving their neighbors, which is really what we're called to do, and not. So I'm not saying all the other stuff, the strategy and all that stuff is bad. But when you strip all that away, what are we really about? And I think it forces us to be really about the important things.
Yeah,
so I think that's a good side of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's ways in which Victoria and I have been. So there's both the positive sides and the negative sides. Well, I don't want to say positive sides of the secularization, but as far as the cultures we live in, but it means some of the negative sides that I've seen is just the desire to be for my own independence and my own. Stand on my own two legs. And so it even in Sweden, because it's a little bit, we're different than in Spain in that way, but there's the sense of isolation that ends up happening. And so you end up not being community oriented as far as your faith goes, which I think is a really important practice of faith. Yeah. But you talk about the idea of how being in a different context than maybe what, we formed our views and our understanding of the gospel in and God in the cultures that we come from. I'll be honest. Sweden has been, so I've served in Central Asia, North Africa. I've been in other places of the world as well, but those are the places that I've lived in Sweden. And this has been the most difficult place that I've been, but it's every place that I've been, has caused me to have to reevaluate the foundation of what I'm calling the gospel or my understanding of who Jesus is. Christians in each one of those places have taught me really important things. And I've also seen a lot of what I guess you could say the dross that gets burned away from the precious metal. So, it was interesting when the year I got married, I started the year it was about a year process, maybe 18-month process. So I started the year in Central Asia. I moved to North Africa, then California, and then ended up in Sweden, and all in an 18-month process. And during that time, not a single one of my core political positions changed, but I went from a, far right raving lunatic, or, actually it would have been way kind of a little bit of a left-leaning lunatic to a crazy left-leaning lunatic to California, where I was on the crazy, I was on the right. And then I moved to Sweden, where it was like, you come from Texas, like you're as far right as could possibly ever. I like to tell people that where the Swedish left, where the American left ends, the Swedish right begins. So anyway, there's all those things, but in every step of the way, in order to try to communicate the gospel, I've had to kind of question, what am I assuming about the gospel? How much of my politics is wrapped up in my view of who God is, what's right and wrong, and all the different things that I've had to struggle with, and work through. And some of the things that I still hold on and say, those are the things I'm going to hold on to. Other things I've had to go, okay, maybe this one's not as important as I once thought it was, or maybe I'm putting too much emphasis on it for this context. I think it mentioned before, but the idea that presentation of the gospel does not have to start with you are a sinner. Yeah. One must achieve an understanding of one's sin at some point. Yeah. But the reality that is actually could begin with the goodness of the world we live in and all of those things. And so you kind of have to assume those things. But I think that's the activity, and that's the difficulty in a secular age, when everyone's viewpoint is that salad bar approach. Yeah. Yeah. Then you have to determine who am I talking to? So every gospel presentation, so to speak, becomes a almost a specialized approach, or a personally tailored approach to understanding the person. And so you have to interact with asking questions and getting to know them, and take your time to kind of unravel or take apart that little salad bar. So it's the endeavor of it is incredibly painstaking. Yeah. In so many ways.
I think you hit on something there, because there are some underlying assumptions that most people are working with, but then you do have this individualization of what people think and believe and how they, because even when we're talking about these generalized ideas, there's people sitting at home, if they heard this, they go, well, that's not anything like me, but I consider myself a secular person. Right. Because you have all kinds of, for all kinds of different ways this plays out in people. And so it's incredibly complicated. Yeah. I think that's why it would be interesting to have my friends on, because, they've started a church here in Granada. And so they have a different, you and I work mainly with college students, but right. they're reaching college students, but they've got maybe their feet more in a church world where they're also dealing with people who maybe aren't college students or didn't go to college. And so they're seeing how that plays out acutely across the spectrum, the cultural spectrum. So I think that would be interesting, because I don't know, like, what's it like for a working class family in Europe? How do they look at those things?
Yeah. And I think what would be interesting to find out is how much people reflect on those things, your average person. Yeah. One of the things that I'm realizing in my own life is the more noise I put into it. So between podcasts, sorry people who are listening to this, but also, television or Netflix or reading or music, my mind doesn't stay at rest. And by not staying at rest, sometimes I don't reflect properly, or I don't allow the difficult things to come up. It's easy to medicate in some sense. Yeah. And so I wonder how much people entertain themselves to make the hurt go away, or even just the deep thought go away. Yeah. And I wonder how much your average person does that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's several books and studies, there's a book, Entertaining Ourselves to Death.
Yeah. Right.
I think there's a lot of people pointing out that, we're talking about living in a non-reflexive society. So society, and it doesn't really ask those questions of itself, or we don't typically think about, and so we have our blind spots, our assumptions, but we don't typically try to undermine those. And we don't typically ask those big questions. Now, some people do, and I think probably deep down, everyone maybe is asking a little bit of that question,
right?
Deep down. But I think you're right. Maybe we find ways of avoiding those questions. And what's interesting is we, in Europe, more and more. I had a friend tell me this, and just a friend from school. His kids go to the same school as my kids, saying he said, it seems to me more and more being a person who believes in God and has, tries to keep their family together and tries to, have a clear direction. It seems more and more that is contra to society. That's revolutionary. So, I don't know exactly.
Is it revolutionary in a sense of admirable? Was that the way he was thinking of it? Or was he thinking revolutionary in the sense of odd?
Odd. I don't think he was admirable. I mean, he would probably subscribe to those values more than anyone.
Yeah.
But he would say the scene is revolutionary or contra to what is normal.
Right. Yeah, because I actually, I agree with that. So I've had several, let's say, acquaintances or people we know, get divorced, and we've had conversations about, well, have you thought about counseling or different things to try to keep things together? And one of the problems is actually counselors a lot of times in the secular environment, their assumption is, well, if you're not happy, you should get out.
Yeah.
So the individual is such an arbiter of all things right and wrong that to that point that it's actually not worth keeping anything together from their perspective, because those aren't values that would hold on to. So I think it makes actually incredibly hard for the Christian to enter that. Even if you say, hey, your marriage is on the rocks, there's this awesome marriage ministry, God wants your, whatever. People just kind of look at you like, but why? Like, I'm not happy. I'm ready to be done with this.
Yeah.
It makes it incredibly hard. The thing that I keep thinking about lately, and this is why I talk a lot to people about the long game. Mm-hmm. People can look at China and, population wise has the most Christians of any country in the world now. And, percentage of population is still relatively low, but as far as total number of Christians, the most of any country. And, missions wise, there was a period of just incredible explosion there. It slowed down some. And that's been in our lifetime. And people can look at that and they can go, wow, look at what happened.
Yeah.
If they have the short view. But if they have the long view, which I'm more a fan of, you look at guys like, Hudson Taylor and all the rest who saw very little fruit, and some who saw no fruit. But don't underestimate the number of people who came to Christ today, because those guys were planting seeds and creating people who are praying, and all of these things that we don't tend to think about. And that's what I mean by the long game. Part of the long game that I think we have to be playing in the that makes it sound so like that it's some kind of competition and we're going to win, but more just we need to be thinking, having the long view of history.
Yeah.
We need to realize how important it is for us as Christians to be a presence of peace in the world that we're in. Mm-hmm. So families or people who are doing things that are just considered freakishly odd, taking a Sabbath, resting, turning your phone off, not being addicted to it, not looking at pornography, all of these things, but yet eventually a certain number of people, and I'm not saying all of society, but a certain number of people will start to look at that and start going, wait a second, you're doing something different.
Yeah.
And your life is different. Yeah. I continue to go back to the world we are in is chaotic. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. I got to figure out how Jesus would live so that the church and so that I can be a peaceful harbor in the midst of the storm. And so I more and more, here, obviously, you won't find anyone that's not a bigger proclaimer of the gospel than I am. I love talking to people about Christ, but more and more, I just continue to think of how important it is to to develop peace in my life and in the people around me, because that over time becomes attractive to a world that has nothing. There is nothing that can offer peace, only short-bought gains.
Yeah. Well, we're in a fascinating time right now because, I mean, we'll get through it, but what we're seeing in humanity is not in control of its destiny as it would like to be.
Yeah. Right.
And so that's a big question. And, are we the people who in the midst of this are calm, are patient, are following the rules, are doing our best to love our neighbor, as within the confines of what we can. And so I think those are the big questions. I think there's so many things to unpack in this conversation. Every time you say something, I'm kind of thinking to another data point in my head or another writer.
Right?
So at some point we need to get into Zygmunt Bauman. Liquid.
That's what the folks are really.
I think he's.
How many podcasts have quoted him?
But he's this idea. Well, you were talking about relationships falling apart. Yeah. He talks about that. He's got a whole book called Liquid Love. And that we have lost as a modern society the ability to be. I don't want to say faithful, but the ability to be faithful in our relationships, right?
Yeah. And
he's not just talking about marriage or family, but it's talking about society.
Yeah. It's
so easy for us to go, well, I mean, how many people are out here in Spain running the quarantine because they want to be comfortable, so they're doing the stuff.
Right.
How many
dogs have they killed walking them to death?
Yeah. Well, the guy in Canary Islands the other day who got arrested for walking a chicken.
Did he?
Yeah. He took a chicken out for a walk. So
hey, chickens got to move their legs.
Yeah. But that's a fundamental. You see I don't want to be too critical on young people because young people are I was young also, but people go to the beach. Got off from school because of the quarantine, and everyone went to the beach, and you just But that's a symbol of our own selfishness as humans. Probably more hyper that in this day and age because of our own sense of individualism that it's all about me, and we're living in the midst of I think that's off the charts for most people right now.
So I listened. This was awesome. I listened to this podcast, and there's this guy Rob Long who is he used to be a writer on Cheers and has been producing stuff in Hollywood for years, and really funny guy. But he's also he's on some political podcasts too. And he was saying that he was in this meeting in Hollywood that's really hurting from all this stuff because no one's going to movie theaters.
Yeah,
and he said there was in this meeting and people just kept saying, y'all, it's not about us. It's not about us. And he goes, what kind of narcissistic world do you have to live in that you have to keep saying that? But it's true, people, we really do think, and myself included, I find myself thinking so often how much is my first inclination to think about my own comforts or how this thing affects me or how can I get around it or, this particular time in history really highlights that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, man, we keep hitting longer than we said we were going to go.
What we go here? 30?
We're at 42 minutes, buddy.
42. Wow.
We just keep.
We were going to try to be short this time.
Yeah. Well, minutes. It's just so much good stuff, man. It's just a lot of fun. Okay. So give me something that you're either reading or watching.
Okay. So real quick. And, I think at some point in the future, if this keeps going, we should come back to Terrance Malick. But I started watching Tree of Life last night, and I only saw half of it because it's a pretty long movie. Yeah. But so far, I think it might be the movie for this time right now because it's asking the question, God, where are you in all this suffering and pain? But it's basically what seems to be the book of Job, but kind of artistically expressed.
That's really cool.
And it's all set in Texas, so it's really, so as a Texan, I like watching because you see, oh, I've been there, or oh, that looks like downtown Dallas or Houston, right? Or hey, that looks like pretty much all those small towns in Texas where you go in the main square and the courthouse is in the middle.
Yeah.
And they got all the businesses around it, and it's very idyllic and the architecture. So I've enjoyed that part, but also the kind of there's a real it's not an easy movie to watch, if you're not a cinephile, but it's the depth of the theology that's going on there is pretty powerful.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
This is off point, but your mention of Texas and Texas film, was it you, Garrick, that took a pilgrimage to the motel?
Bottle Rocket, yes. we were on our way back. I've driven by it. Barrett's referencing the first Wes Anderson movie, Bottle Rocket, which is a classic.
It's fantastic.
Actually, one of Martin Scorsese's favorite movies.
Is it? Really?
Yeah, it's a brilliant movie, but it's his first movie, and they filmed part of it in Hillsboro in this hotel. It's right off the side of I-35, and so we were driving back from some ministry stuff, the whole family, and you could tell people were kind of hungry. So I thought, we're gonna pull over, and there's a McDonald's right next to it. So I got the kids and the wife in the McDonald's, and then I went over to the hotel and kind of walked around it, and went out into the field where there's this really great shot where they're shooting Roman candles and bottle rockets off in the movie, and they're in this field, and that field's still there, and the pool's still there. It's been renovated, so it didn't look that kind of classic, that kind of a 60s, 70s kind of feel.
There are all sorts of pilgrimages, aren't there?
There are. You can go anywhere, and so that for me, that was if you know me, Wes Anderson films, but that was a very special moment.
Yeah, cool. Well, I am.
What are you watching? What are you reading?
Among other things, I don't know. My wife and I, we really enjoy MasterChef. But we enjoy the Swedish version. So one of the cool things about the Swedish version is they're just really polite to each other. It's really refreshing. The American version is all about, I want to jump down your throat and I'm going to cut throat. It's like, I hate that guy. They're so arrogant,
Yeah.
And of course the producers are getting to do all this.
Yeah.
But the Swedish version, like participants, like when they're done, they go over, like when they get kicked off or they lose or whatever, they go up and like everyone's crying because they've made a good friend, and it's just like this, and they kind of cheer each other on when they're like, hey, I thought you did that was a really great dish, a really good idea. It's actually this really cool thing. That's one of the things, actually, living in a different culture, you learn to appreciate that other cultures do really well. And you kind of say, wow, that's a good part of this culture. That's one of the great things about Swedish culture is early on, you learn how to do teamwork. So even my kids are first grade and third grade, and a lot of their classwork is done in teams, and they learn very early on how to communicate in teams.
That's fascinating.
And you root for each other.
Yeah.
And I love that part about Swedish culture. You do it in a very Swedish way, right? I mean, you dance around like a Swedish chef.
I was trying not to make that joke.
I know
when you said Swedish cook.
You've been fighting it.
Come on,
we've done now almost 2 hours of podcast, and you've been fighting it for 2 hours.
Swedish chef.
You're just waiting.
You did it though.
I think he should be called the Norwegian chef because he seems more Norwegian.
Sounds
anyway.
more,
So anyway, so this is one of the things I love. So we just finished the 10th season of that, and really enjoyed it. And then I'm reading. Actually, you mentioned Stefan Pass, so you and I have talked so much about him, but I actually had never read. I read a few things that he posted on the internet and things like that, but I decided I was going to do a deep dive into some of his books. So I'm reading Church Planting in the Western Secular Cultures. Yeah, and really, really good stuff.
Good stuff I just started reading it too. So that's great.
Well, I'm looking forward to you and I. Hopefully doing a deep. I actually think it'd be fun to get Pass on here. I bet he'd probably.
I think I've got a friend who did some research with him. The guy who was in Granada, a Dutch guy. So we might have some connections there already.
I have a bit of history of convincing renowned theologians to do things they otherwise wouldn't do. So.
You and Sam Perez. I'm just going to call up NT Wright. And see
here's what it is. Guys who do scholastic work have so few people calling them and think that their stuff is so cool that they're willing to talk about it anywhere.
That's true.
So
that's true.
I think they'd probably come on. Well, Garrick, man, always a pleasure.
Yeah.
This is episode 2, more or less in the books here. A little bit of editing, a little bit of things.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, folks, if anyone has any things you want to hear Garrick and I talk about, any subject matter, you can contact at we're going to come up with a contact email for that. Most of you listening right now.
If you're listening, you know how to get a hold of us.
That's
probably.
Right. If you're listening, you know how to get a hold of us. But I'm going to come up with, I was about to give away my personal email address. I was like, this is probably not a good idea.
not in the world of Russian hackers. But we didn't get to Tiger King, but we need to get to Tiger King at some point.
Oh my gosh. Can we actually, we've already gone over. So can we do 2 or 3 minutes on Tiger King?
You want to keep going?
Yeah, well, we're gonna miss the cultural moment of Tiger King, and then us commenting on Tiger King will be, passé, right?
Okay.
So I totally forgot. So we're just gonna go over. Maybe I'll cut some things out that are boring, or we just put it up there and
just suffer. See. And hey, so if you're listening, you don't want to hear about Tiger King, or you want to take a break, go for it, and then come back and hear about Tiger King.
Those who haven't thrown their phone across the room yet
or asleep.
All right. So give us some context for Tiger King. And then we'll I have some actually very particular ideas about Tiger King, but you give us some context.
It's a fascinating documentary on Netflix about a subculture that I didn't know existed, which is people who own private zoos would have, and trade cats. In big cats. And it's a very fascinating subculture in America. But Tiger King is about this guy, Joe Exotic in Oklahoma, and his fall from grace. He gets involved in all kinds of horrible things, and he's in prison now. I think a lot of those people are going to go to prison
it seems like
that documentary, but fascinating. So that's kind of it.
So it's like one of the, if it's not the number one, I know in Sweden it's the number one show right now.
Yeah.
On Netflix.
I think globally,
and I think
it's
it might,
the big thing.
And I'm seeing on social media and stuff, those that I do check every now and then, people dressing up as Tiger King, watching it. And I was having a conversation today about this phenomenon. And I think that in large measure, personally, I think part of it is that people are wanting some kind of escape. You want to find something that is weirder than the situation I find myself in.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, this is, I'm going to end. I mean, it's a little bit about you're watching a train wreck happen, right? So that's possible. But it's just this moment of, I think, stress levels in some degree. And it's a latent stress. It's not a, oh my gosh, I'm going to die right now, there's bombs going off. But it's the kind of stress that's just like, I find myself at the end of most days going, I just want to laugh. And so I'm going onto YouTube and finding stupid, Enneagram people at Starbucks or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Tiger King is fascinating, and we can mine the depths more of that. You and I, maybe privately.
I think there's something about the reality of it, right?
Yeah,
because you could make a movie that had all those elements. Although I don't know if you could actually come up with some of the stuff that was going on in there. It's exactly, so bizarre, right? And it keeps making turns and twists, and you just can't believe that this is happening.
Right.
I think there's also part of this is reality, and we can look at it and go, I'm not sure where I want to go with that, but I think there's something about that. You could have made a movie and gone, and it probably would have been a pretty cool movie. But the fact that these are real people.
Yep. Well, I mean, look, also, movies were made that are hilarious, but didn't do as well as this has done. So you've got Strictly Ballroom, you've got Best in Show, Waiting for Guffman, right? Those are essentially Tiger King, a pared down Tiger King, but didn't do quite as well. And part of it is, the unbelievable nature of what actually exists. Yeah. This is why actually living overseas, people will come up to me and go, hey, I've heard in America, and then fill in the blank. And my comment is always, there's everything in America.
Yeah, everything.
And so if someone would have come to me, I've heard that there's big cat owners who own zoos and this guy named Tiger King or whatever, Joe Wild, I would have said, there's everything in America. Yeah. Because there literally is everything. Yeah, there's everything. If you can dream it, it is there.
The world's an interesting place.
The world is an interesting place, and it's going to continue being an interesting place. And hopefully you and I are here to talk about it.
Yes. Garrick? All right. Thanks, Barrett.
Thanks for the podcast, man. Have a good one.
Awesome.